Bomone gente ayekene unu ọzọ n'ụbọchị uhuruchi tata tata bụ 27th of November 2023. Ewetakwala unu ya bụ nnukwu ozi dị oke mkpa mana ọ nwere advice achọrọ inye before anyị egosi unu ya bụ ife anyị ji maka ya wee bịa n'uhuruchi tata. Biko ọ bụ na ịbụ onye Igbo, ọ bụ na ịbụ onye Biafra, biko watch this video. Yeah, Biafra elder narrate everything about Biafran war. So if I could say and open with Fenabogo Juganya, Master Makife Merubu, Igamataki Fena Vida no in a Genua. So you can see a beef of more from a drop or like comment again. Na Eastern News 24. Gaya beef of much Tepena Iabo Eastern News 24. Kai see when I would tell you no, is Boto Nukozia do Kempa. Over to you, sir.
And one important statement which must ring through history. That's when Ahmadu Bello now kind of cautioned Awolowo and Azikiwe. You know, actually what happened was Azikiwe was telling Ahmadu Bello, can we sink our differences so that we can move forward? Now Ahmadu Bello said, please let us understand our differences. Do you know that statement pre-1960 is still subsisting till today? And until you get some of these little vignettes, you cannot even interpret what has now led into all this agitation. Exactly. Now, move forward. Came whatever it was, independence, and even before then, there was heckling of. When Ahmadu Bello came to Lagos, he was being heckled in Lagos. That is like, why are you wasting our time? What the heck? And they didn't like it, and the Northerners didn't like it. It produced one of the first riots in the North. So it is not today we started riots, massacre, killing of people. It started way back before 1960. These are the subliminal issues that were not resolved and cleared away. And then you moved into independence. And we only had independence. And remember too that it was even the effort by the North, the NPC, to make an inroad into the Western region. And when there was an issue between Akintola, who was the premier of the Western region, and Awolowo, who was the leader of the party, way back in 1952, there was I think a conference in Jos. That agitation produced the quakes and quacks that occurred in 1965 towards 1966. And it became a riot of a kind because the two people could not agree. And the Northerners were wanting an inroad into the West, and Akintola seemed to be their point man. And at that time, remember, there were I think they were one of the breaks. So we're now looking at Niger Delta. So there was an effort to come into the Niger Delta using bricks, and there was an effort to use Akintola to also move in. And so that division between Awolowo and Akintola exacerbated the crisis in the West till it became an agitation that produced, call it an insurrection. What you are now even talking about today, we also had it then. And what happened? We had this famous Operation Wetier, when they brought the northern soldiers to come and quell the riot in the West. And remember, as at that time they were forced to bring one Maji Kodumi, who is a medical doctor, who was the administrator of the whole Western region. And because of this Operation Wetier, when they called them the soldiers, I won't put any tribe to it, when they came, it was so that when you came and you wanted to wage the war, your cloth would not leave your body. That was the Operation Wetier. It was that bad. And that culminated into all the agitation that brought the bad feelings that eventually resulted in the instability. And when there was going to be this coup, Archbishop Makarios, now late, of Cyprus, he was here. It was the Commonwealth Conference in Lagos. He was trapped during this conference, and he couldn't leave because the coup caught him. Now, we'll go to that coup. The coup occurred, as a result of whatever it is, the young boys in the army were not too satisfied about the way the country was going. One of the complaints in that January 15th massacre and broadcast had to do with the 10%ers. That is, all the politicians were taking every contract they gave, they ate 10% out of it. So the language was they were against the 10%ers. They were against. So it's not today we. So it is not today we started this agitation about the politicians dipping their hands in the public till. It was always there. So they didn't like that, and so when they staged the coup. Remember that it was a coup, according to Aburi, who was one of the majors who joined Major Nzogu to stage this coup. Now, the story we heard, because we are not soldiers, but the story we heard, and from that, it was called I've forgotten the title of the book, the Five Majors. That was what Aburi wrote. And it was trying to tell the story that it was like a nationalistic movement. Remember that time, because of this fracas between Akintola and Awolowo was imprisoned, and part of the story is that they wanted Awolowo freed in order to come and take up some role in government, and so that was part of the reason they adduced. Then you had the reason of the 10%ers, but now came the way the coup occurred. Nwafo Orizu, who was the Senate president, was the acting president. Azikiwe took off for whatever reason, whether for health reason or whatever. He was in the Caribbean, and then Nwafo Orizu became the acting president. Then when they staged the coup, the highest person was Aburi Accord. Now, whether you like it or not, we must go back to the class structure of the 60s. As at that time, it's not what you are now looking at now. The Igbos were more dominant in terms of wealth, in terms of education. Who was the vice chancellor of Ibadan? Professor Kanodike, a historian.
Wow. We believe the Yorubas, the West, they were more educated.
No. Well, they have their own story. But then, Eni Njoku, who was a biologist, was the vice chancellor of Lagos. Right? People like Ikejani, who was the minister for transport, was an Igbo man. So in terms of structure, then in the army, who were those who were more in the ranking of officers? They were Igbos. So it's in terms of structure, they were already there. And it was this coup that now upturned too many things, no matter how you want to look at your history. Those are facts of history. Now came the fact that when the coup occurred, our man from the Delta, Kochebo, was killed. Omimiejo. Again, he was a man for finance, and of course, he was looked upon as not too clean. Then, of course, Balewa, who was a soft-spoken man, was the prime minister. He was killed. And, of course, either for his softness or colluding. Because it's not today when you want to look at how the Northerners play the game. There was definitely a collusion about power grab in that time. And so he was killed. Ahmadu Bello was killed. And I'm told that it was Nzogu who moved him. And because when Nzogu had finished killing him, in front, I think, of his wife, according to the story, he had to break the glass. Because one of the earliest pictures we saw of Nzogu after the coup was a handband, which showed that he was injured as he broke the glass and jumped down. So, but it was said that by then they had created Midwest. Who was to have been killed here? Osadibe, who was the premier of Midwest. Okpara was the premier of the East. Okpara was not killed. Osadibe not killed. Then over the months, it became like, was it an Igbo-induced coup? Because who was on top? It's Aburi Accord. And it is said that the constitutional lawyer, Professor Nwabueze, was the one who helped to draft the unitary constitution that Aburi implemented. But the question when you read history, because people sometimes try to make judgments, was it done in the name of wanting to capture power, or it was to save the country? Because as at that time, the country was not united. And remember that we're using the Westminster Constitution, and it was felt as at that time that we're not uniting, and therefore the only way you can harmonize the country into one whole, call it national cohesion, using constitutional method, was to have this constitution, which is called the Unification Decree, promulgated by Aburi. Now it is said that infuriated the Northerners, and the Northerners, after all this killing, thinking or saying that a lot of their top soldiers, people like Pam, one of the top brigadiers of the Northerners, was killed, and some Northern officers. So they now felt this unification, they were not for it. They would rather break off. And the chant then was Araba. Araba means divide. That's the Hausa word for divide. So let's divide, let's divide. That was the cry. Then, so after the killing, then for 2 or 3 days there was no government in place in Nigeria. January 15, 16, 17 of 1966, there was no government. Remember that they had taken over the constitution and handed, that is, Nwaforizu formally handed power to Aburi. So the power was with the military. The head of state had been killed, so there was no party in place. The next most senior person was Brigadier Ogundikpe. But when the July thing happened, during that reprisal, when they killed Ironsi, Ogundikpe had to run into a seaboat to go and hide. And remember, as at that time, there was the issue of order and superiority in the army. Never mind what has happened over the years. Over the years, we've destroyed our seniority. So, since Ogundikpe was the man in charge, when they were now looking for who to give direction, people said Ogundikpe. But Ogundikpe was not to be found. Therefore, who will give command? And in the army and the structure then, the most senior man gives command. And of course, as at that time, the Northerners had, after that coup of July, decided that it was Lieutenant Colonel Gowon. And as at that time, what was his age? What was the age of Ojukwu? What was the level of education? Remember that apart from military training and secondary school, that was all that Gowon had. Ojukwu was already a graduate from Oxford, a degree from Oxford. Then he had also gone through Sandhurst, which are some of the elite military schools. He had gone through all that. So Ojukwu insisted, let's take command from the most senior person. So it's like, I wouldn't take command from another little boy like myself. So there was, call it an ego and age thing as at that time. So now I'm taking you back into history, because sometimes people look at these things and they rush it, and just once you just dismiss it with a wave, it's either Yoruba, it's either North, it's this. There were little things that were happening, and all of this aggravated the situation. So it was in the midst of neither going forward nor coming back, we now decided that they now had to hold, call it the military group, with Adeba Adeyinka, who was the administrator for Western region. Ojukwu was in the east. Ejo was here in Midwest. Hassan was the military administrator, or military governor, or whatever you want to call him, in the north. They came to Benin City. Benin City became the place that was the part of the history of trying to resolve the crisis of Nigeria in 1966.
Amazing. Benin City, amazing.
And it was, look, they were there for a day or two at nightfall. That's when they held the meeting. Then the meeting, of course, you know how people raised temper, blood had been shed, anger had been in the land, and how do you resolve it? When it couldn't finally be resolved at the meetings in nightfall, they decided, through the instrumentality of General Afrifa, who was the head of state of Ghana. Now he said, you come to Ghana, a neutral place, and let's now all of us discuss. And so they went to Aburi. And so when they went to Aburi for this, conference to try and resolve these issues. What now happened? Believe it or not, and what I'm going to say is quite crucial to this storytelling, and which is that the position of Midwest, and Nauro was one of those who also brought in idea. Then Omo Erediawa was a permanent secretary. Then I think he was in the cabinet office. So these are people who also played some roles. Now the position of Nahoro and the position of Midwest was a confederation. But that was not a position that was quite agreed. But by and large, they wanted to really move towards a confederation where everybody can be by yourself, rather than this close-up that we are in. The unification as a way to modify that unification decree of Aguironsi. That was when all this talk about a different kind of constitution. And remember that we're also using the Western model, because you also have to put it in apropos to when Murtala Mohammed finally came. We now decided that, look, the parliamentary system has failed us. Why don't we now go to a presidential system? This is what led to this presidential system. Not that it just happened from the blues. It was the way we were now running ourselves. But then we're going back again to where we were and headed to Aburi. At that Aburi conference, which occurred maybe for a day or two, everybody agreed on this kind of, call it, loose federation. But there was an agreement, seemingly more tilting towards a confederation. And of all the people who went there, it was Ojukwu who had a secret recorder, which of course we in the media normally use. So he recorded the entire conference deliberations in Aburi. And that by the time they came, and it looks as if the North was now going to lose the power that they have finally gotten through military arms and military force. Apparently, as it was said, the British government or the British High Commissioner advised them, because the Northerners were more keen on breaking away. They said, no, that will not be in your interest. Stay and hold the power that you've gotten. So when 2-3 days the decision from Aburi was not being implemented, what did you expect? So when Ojukwu waited for days for the decision by Gowon to be announced, at least as they had agreed in Aburi, it wasn't coming. Rather, it was go on with one Nigeria. Remember that was an acronym taken from GOWON, go on with one Nigeria. Then the Easterners said, on Aburi we stand. Can you see the two different positions? Okay. Now, as at that point in time, there was more mayhem. It was bloody. What we are going through now, we went through it in 1966. When Easterners, people's eyes were gorged. The things you're hearing and reading in the papers today, this has been a habit. This has been a habit. They'll get your eyes gorged off from the socket. Oh. Women who were pregnant, they ripped them apart and threw them. And to put it in the way they would have said it, call it the accent, Ga and Meta Ajuku. You can hear it was like. And then they went into the barracks and slaughtered the Igbo officers. The ordinary Igbo man, people trek from Kaduna Zaria. My own sister used to work, she with her husband used to work in Samaru. That was in one of the in Zaria. That's part of the University of ABU. They also had to come. There was a total dislocation in the country. People fled from the north and everybody heading to his own place. And the Igbos had no choice. The Igbos didn't have a choice because the insecurity was too high. You could not trust that you'll be safe where you are. And Ojukwu now said, okay, if there's a situation, they now began to make preparation for some kind of warfare.
To fight back.
Whether to fight back or whatever they wanted to do. So they said the views of the elders was that, hold on, people like Azikiwe wanted to mediate, given his position, education, international outreach, former president of Nigeria. But remember, what was the age of Ojukwu? So you see, and remember, when a young man could be angry, could be terribly angry, terribly upset. And besides, when you saw people just dead bodies and injured bodies just brought back on train from the north, and your people were no longer safe, even in Lagos, Ibadan, people were returning. What do? So you now come to the fact that the man now said the only way they can safeguard themselves was to have a country of their own. And so they now declared Biafra.
This is so deep. This is really, really deep. Amazing. Wow, this is a part of history I believe very few people know about. Very few, because some of the things you just said was like, so this whole thing happened like this. Because the story we're hearing is quite different from what you're saying now.
Yes, of course. Yes. We wish. You see, this is where they always say Nigerians should write. We don't write. We ought to document these things either by docudrama, by some kind of writing, some memoirs. Exactly. But just a few people did write. People like Colonel Boulier wrote. Ojukwu wrote a little bit, but he didn't write too deeply. Maybe the pain didn't allow him to write. Then you had people like Rafu Wechwe, who was in the diplomatic corps. He was in France. He also wrote. So, reflections on the Civil War. So there were books, but then you needed more. Then people like Colonel, now Brigadier Alabi Sama, he wrote. So a couple of people wrote, but it's not enough. You needed more stories, more writings, more experiences, more documentation. Because one of those things people always ask, what did we learn and what did we live? Okay, even if you want to ask that question, a very deep-seated question, one of those things today, were it not that some people have brought up the paper and Gowon had even accepted it to become a way out of development of Nigeria in form of industrialization. Remember that during that Civil War, they developed what they call Ubunigwe. And Ubunigwe was a massive killer. It was like an IED. You know an IED that destroys when you're in a war front? Right. So the Ubunigwe, when it is placed and you step on it, you are all gone. How did they have their fuel to drive around? Exactly. Fine, they were refining crude oil. They were also refining palm oil. What were people eating? Some ate lizard just to survive.
We heard those stories of them eating,
because it was true. And but people managed running from here, there, throughout that 3 years. And of course, initially, one of the reasons that made Ojukwu dare the federal government was that when it comes to officer corps, there were more Igbos. When it comes to some ammunition, they had something. And they were hoping that they would get recognition from some countries and that would bring arms. But that didn't quite come, because suddenly, either through the instrumentality of the British embassy and so on, they got the Russians, because the Russians came with their MiG fighters, and a few countries supported the federal government, and so there was this all-out escalated war.
Oh, sir, I want to ask this question. If the Ojukwu had not taken that step because it caused lots of destruction, so what other step would he have taken as they probably thought another way instead of declaring independence for just the Igbos? Do you think that was a wise decision he took, or there would have been another way to maneuver the whole thing and settle everything?
A very difficult question. Why I say it's difficult? Sometimes with hindsight, we like to ask questions about what could have been. But it so happened that was the decision he took. And remember that he wasn't quite all alone. After all, remember that there was Lieutenant Colonel Banjo who joined him, who's a Yoruba man. Because it was Banjo who was asked to come to the Midwest. After he's led the troops here, he shouldn't stop here. He should go straight to Lagos and hold Lagos. That was part of when the Biafrans incursed into Midwest. And then he seemed to have stopped here a little bit. They moved over and stopped at Ore. And that wasn't the instruction. The instruction was go and hold Lagos, so that will now give us some, just like what you had with that Okaku, when you had places excised. That is, you take the south and then you now use it as a point of bargaining. But it didn't happen that way, and that was what incensed Ojukwu to recall Banjo. And no, sadly, Banjo was killed. Sadly. But those are part of the sad stories of the event. Whether there was any other decision he could have taken, you see, because of the insecurity. Because you see, you go fly back and come to today. Why are people talking about secession? Why are people agitated? Because when you now want to say, what could we do in the face of headsmen coming now and wanting to kill you? Okay, what do you do? So it's very fine to sit down. You're comfortable enough to say, oh, they could have taken a decision not to break away. They didn't have any. I don't think they had any choice. But you save your head, because self-defense is primordial. You have to defend yourself, and they wanted to save themselves. Never mind that some of the decisions could have been wrong. Like people would say, okay, you took Rivers, what is now Rivers? You took that was the whole eastern region. But in order to break them, Gowon now moved in and created the 12-state structure. That was to dislocate the power that Biafra had. Because by the time you now freed the river, the people who are now cross river, freed the people who are rivers, people who are now Bayelsa, freed them out. Then of course they will agitate for their own freedom. They will not want to be under Biafra. So they will not want to align with the federal government. So those were some of the efforts during the war by which this one went here, this one went there. And so the war was waged for 3 sad years. And we were all privy to it. They were passing through here. And the day, for example, the so-called liberated Midwest, led by Ogbemudia, who led the troop, because this is his place. You ought to have seen what happened in the afternoon. They were moving into Benin. Suddenly, school children had to be ferried away from these classrooms. Market women had to, because nobody knew what was going to happen. And throughout 2, 3, 4 days, for example, you've never been to a war front. No, I don't know whether you want to pray for it, but whether you pray for it, you don't pray for it, you see it in the movies. Yeah. We were live hearing, look, gunshot, booms of gun, bombshells, everything was happening. That is, they were just literally to intimidate and also to awe and to impress. So for a whole night you'll be hearing gunshots and booms of gun and throughout, before they now moved into the east and started, but it was tough, because even the Igbos had to resist. They were not going to stay and be killed. They had their people whom they recruited, whom they trained, and who believed that they ought to be free, because you wouldn't like, some of them were bereaved, and so some had pain in their hearts, so they joined. Then there was the rump of the old army who was leading the corps, because they were already trained in the Nigerian Air Force, Nigerian military. People like Conan Wawo, who is of course Delta, but that is now when you say Delta, but it was Midwest. But they were now had to go to the east. There was one other guy, forgotten his name, from Okpanam, who was also in the army. So they were all there. So it was like all the Igbos moved home, and then the other people stayed here, and that's how we all divided. Now, when the war ended, people said, I was going to tell you about the industrialization. What you ought to have, the people who brought paper to go and believe that it ought to be at the end of the cessation of the hostilities in January 1970. That look, why don't we buy into this technology of the Igbos? That will hasten the movement of Nigeria. Murtala Muhammad went on to go on to say, that's not on. Will you allow you to arm your enemies? Which had nothing to do with arming them, but giving them the opportunity so that we can now use that knowledge of technology to industrialize Nigeria. That's when Nigeria lost immensely the opportunity to even grow. So we ought to have come out of the war better than we did. After all, how did Japan move? How did Germany move? Exactly. Not from the wars, but what happened? We used our war and came down. And after that, there's this untold story, an untold policy that the Igbos cannot be accommodated and cannot be trusted. because they waged war, if you like, against their fatherland. Despite the statement of Gowon at the end of 1970, no victor, no vanquished. Then they created the 3 R's, reconstruction, rehabilitation, and something. Now, those were supposed to bring back the eastern states. Former university lecturer Aburi Accord was made the administrator of the East Central State. Now, of course, did it ever happen? Was there enough money sent? Meanwhile, the houses the Igbos had, in Post-coup especially, were seized by people and called abandoned property. You know what it is? A house you built. If you go to, here in Benin, if you went down to Secondary Circular, where you have Fit Motors, that used to be Mogambo Hotel, owned by an Igbo man from Ujoto. You've heard of Niger College in Secondary Circular. Of course, who built it? An Igbo man. You go to Sapele, not Rita. There are some schools there, even in Sapele, built by Igbos. So they were investing here and there. Is it Uromi? You have to keep going around to know how they had also invested. And all these properties are lost. They have not been brought into the system. And to make it worse, there was this indigenization decree that was passed by Gowon. When the Igbos came, never mind that I hear some of my friends are contending with it. When they came, they said, okay, whatever you have in the bank, take 20 pounds. Whatever you have, take 20 pounds. So today, when you now look at what the Igbos have made of their lives, from getting only 20 pounds in 1970 to the Cubana and the Ezego and all this, then you begin to wonder, how did these people come out from call it almost destruction to come to where they are?
And they're still doing good.
I know. So this was what painfully happened, but they lost so much. And you've now, because of that unwritten policy about accommodating them, about taking whatever they have, about trying to integrate them into the country as one nation, so they feel we're not wanted. And if we're not wanted, so what else? We are not wanted. You can't rise up beyond a point. The most that some of them rose were during what's it called, Jonathan, when he had Jerika, who was the chief of army staff. Now it's okay, but you needed more people to be placed in some key positions. Yeah, so it was during the Jonathan's time that there seemed to have been some accommodation for the Igbos. But then what has also happened, but we're not going to go into that, so let's stay with the main story. But that's when they were more brought on, like Jerika became chief of army staff, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, although she's a Bendelite but married to an Abia man, ended up being the coordinating minister and minister for finance. You had Soludo, who was the governor of the central bank. And of course, believe it or not, wherever they were in place, even Nebo, who was the man for energy, then what was he called, the guy who brought the I think it's geothermal company to Aba, to light up Aba, Baton Naji, Professor Baton Naji. Wherever they have been, they have excelled. So sometimes it's like, we can do it, and why are you not even asking for our assistance? And again, look at it in terms of integration into every place. Wherever they go, no matter where the village is, they will build a little house and a little business. Think of the market of spare parts. Even if you're looking for a spare part in Guzo, or looking for in Nkabi, or you're looking for a spare part in Post-coup, an Igbo man will deliver it. How? Whether it's from Hong Kong or wherever it is, he will finally get it to you. They have a nationwide network when it comes to this. So they have capacity, they have depth, they have funds. And so they are like saying, we can, but nobody's asking us about anything. And all they're asking for is, well, can we be asked to take up some key positions in the country, maybe in security, maybe in governance, maybe in policy areas, but nobody's asking us. So it means we're not wanted. Okay, so if we're not wanted, it's affecting even.
Daalụ nne nwanne anyị ndị bụ Igbo ọma na-ege ntị. Dịka o si dị, anyị kenere unu ọfụma ka unu si na-esonyere anyị na-eme na Eastern News 24. Dịka ị nụrụ ife nwanne anyị nwoke kwuru n'elu akwụkwọ bụkwara nna anyị gbasara maka ife mere oge gboo and ihe bitere isu ejiwe n'ọgụ nke Biafra. Ka ife nwere ike ikwu gbasara maka ya bụ ozi nke ị nụrụ n'elu akwụkwọ n'ụbọchị nke taa, drop ọla ya on the comment section below. Nke dịka ibe ya bụ chetakwa na ya kwa Eastern News 24 ka anyị sikwa wee na-ewetara unu ya bụ nnukwu ozi dị oke mkpa unu kwesịrị ịma gbasara maka ife na-eme na be anyị and gbasara maka ife na-eme n'ala Igbo. Daalụ na ụmụnne m, ngwanụ ka emesịanụ.